Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast, brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks to Dr. Andy Barron about implicit association testing. Dr. Barron talks about what IAT is capable of teaching marketers about their products and how consumers connect with those products. He also explores what it takes to make an effective implicit association test and where mistakes can be made.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell, and thanks for listening to this ongoing series on understanding consumer neuroscience. Today, my guest is Dr. Andy Barron. Thank you, Andy, for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
How did you end up being a neuroscientist? I've never met anyone who's like, this is what I wanted to be out of grade school. It seems like a challenging path.
Sure. It was not the path that I originally planned on. In fact, I think my first passion is I wanted to do foreign counterterrorism work for the FBI.
Wow.
And I was specializing in Russian language, literature, and culture. As an undergraduate, I was studying abroad in Russia.
Mm-hmm. So very much a child of the Cold War then?
Something like that.
Yeah.
And I was reading several books by psychologists, How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker.
Mm-hmm.
There's a book by Daniel Dennett, Consciousness Explained. He's a philosopher at Tufts University. And a few other books that got me really excited about the idea of empirically studying how the mind works and understanding human behavior. And I think what attracted me to the idea of foreign counterterrorism work was trying to outsmart really smart criminals. And what drew me to psychology and research was trying to just fundamentally figure out how all people think and be able to predict behavior. And I left Russia and started working more in research labs and trying to gain more experience with different kinds of methods. And I knew that I wanted to then switch to at least a career in cognitive sciences. And so I pursued a PhD in psychology at Harvard University, where I received my master's and PhD in psychology and took courses in cognitive science, social psychology, developmental psychology, really trying to expose myself to very different kinds of methods and approaches to thinking about how the mind works. And while I was in graduate school, I was approached by marketing research consultancy, Olson Zaltman Associates, which got its roots at Harvard, actually, in the business school by one of their founders, Jerry Zaltman, and looking for some help applying methods that I had expertise in, namely the implicit association test, to studying how consumers think implicitly and trying to quantify how people think in an unconscious way. And from there, this is now almost 15 years ago, I've been consulting firms on how to measure what consumers think using methods from the cognitive sciences. And so while I'm still a professor of psychology here at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, I also am advising regularly companies on how to figure out how to advertise their products, reposition their brands. Also on the Scientific Advisory Council for Cloud Army. And again, trying to bring my expertise in academia and my expertise with best practices for measuring how consumers think in an unconscious way to the marketing world.
The implicit association test, and it's not surprising to me you went to Harvard, because if you search on that term, you immediately see a lot of references from Harvard around that. But it's also been associated with some problems too. Do people abuse this concept?
I think people misunderstand its concept more generally. And so first, as it relates to the connections with Harvard, one of the founders of the implicit association test, Mahzarin Banaji, moved from the faculty at Yale University, where she first started pioneering some of this work with Tony Greenwald, and then moved from Yale to Harvard. And then when I joined Harvard, this was just and joined her lab to learn more about this methodology and to further pursue the academic study of how to best employ this type of methodology to study the unconscious mind. And then it sort of just grew and grew from there. So a lot of work came out of that institution. That's why it's so strongly associated with this technique. But one of the beauties of this methodology is that it has been adopted by labs across the world and independently validated across hundreds of labs across the world and many hundreds of scientific published articles that have been peer reviewed. Now, I think there's still a misunderstanding of both what is implicit bias and also what can the tool tell us about how the mind works. And I think where there's some controversy around implicit association testing is when it is suggested that it be used as a way of filtering people. So whether I should consider administering this to decide who to hire for a job and use it as a tool to diagnose someone's level of implicit bias, much like you might say, stick a thermometer, on someone and say, hey, your temperature is too high, and in the time of COVID, you can't come inside.
Right.
I think people try to use it in this way sometimes, or talk about it in this way, when the way at least it's been appropriately used is when we look at populations. We want to understand populations of groups or demographic, and how does the whole population think or respond, say, to an ad, for example, or a product. The tool is best used in that context. I think there's also a general reaction sometimes among some folks in the public around the idea that we can even have unconscious bias. And so I think the conversation is less about concern about, say, implicit association testing, and more about philosophically, is it possible for us to have unconscious biases to begin with? But I certainly think, since the work of Danny Kahneman and economists like him and many others, Malcolm Gladwell, that we certainly can appreciate that there are things going on in our brain that are happening beneath the surface.
For sure.
Right? And so, for example, when I'm speaking, I'm not thinking about all the kinds of syntactic computations that my mind performs, thinking about noun phrases, verb phrases, how to conjugate parts of my sentence. Our brain just does that effortlessly.
Yeah, it's an efficiency thing. You don't want to have to think about each of those details.
Yes.
Your brain is literally designed to do a lot of that work implicitly. Yes. That's why you can walk and chew gum.
Yes. Yes. Or a perfect example, if I'm playing catch with my son outside, while he cannot solve any sort of trigonometry and do any sort of calculus, I can throw the ball and he knows where to put his body to try to catch it.
Yeah.
But if I asked him to write out this problem and try to solve it pen and paper, he's 10. He's going to look at me and just think I'm totally nuts.
Dad's crazy again.
Right. And so there's things that our mind just do at an implicit level. And I think some people, when they think about the implicit association test and they associate with racism, there's this reaction to the idea that, well, there can't be things happening that I'm not in control of. When in reality, there's all kinds of things that happen that we're not in control of. And then accepting the fact that, well, bias might also be one of those things shouldn't be all that, big of a leap to take.
But I really appreciate this idea, certainly from a marketing perspective, that it sounds like it's a mistake to use implicit associated testing to identify traits in an individual to be utilized on the individual. This is meant as a statistical model to measure an array of people to get a sampling of a bias in one form or another. That as soon as you take data for an individual to apply to an individual, you're probably making a mistake. Use it collectively.
Yeah, and I would completely agree. And I think it's a general rule that I would apply to just about every method out there.
Sure.
That we don't have individual thermometers, and that's probably not the best way of thinking about behavior or predicting behavior, because there's so many factors that can influence our behavior, but rather using it to study groups of people, populations. How does the demographic I care about react or respond to something that I'm interested in introducing?
And certainly from a marketing perspective, it's not in my best interest to build tests to select individuals for sale. It's to find the largest group of people that respond positively to a message that I want to convey. So, it sounds to me like IAT makes a lot of sense when I'm looking to help understand a market, or, how I can communicate with that market effectively.
Absolutely. And I think it also makes a lot of sense for two other reasons. One is, if we are on the same page that it's important to measure quantitatively what consumers think at an implicit level, there are very few methods that have been independently validated and studied so extensively as the implicit association test, or IAT. And I think that makes it a very good candidate measure to use in marketing research, because we know so much about what are the best practices for using this type of methodology. Now, second, what makes it a good method for marketing research is that it's capturing something implicit. And what we care about when we measure things implicit, or rather what motivates us to want to study something implicitly in marketing research, is that implicit measures can be very good predictors of behavior when we have many choices, which at least if it's consumer behavior, that's often the case when you go to a store shelf and there's lots of different options for things to consider. But it's also a really good measure of behavior when we're rushed to make decisions, which consumers often find themselves in. And so I think that the evidence, at least from this academic research, points to several reasons why both implicit measures as a category are really important to consider with respect to doing marketing research, but also the implicit association test standing out as a prime example of an ideal measure to use, I think is well supported by the fact that it's been so extensively studied in the academic literature, and there's so much we can make transparent to marketers about why this method is one that is one that you can trust, rather than a method that is opaque and where you have to just rely on the word of the person you're talking with, who's going to be motivated financially to convince you of whatever they want you to think.
Well, it's certainly been an ongoing theme in exploring neuroscience, is recognizing that people will give you the answers you want or not want for a variety of reasons.
Right. And ironically, right, one of the critiques of explicit traditional measures is that you worry that the consumers are just going to tell you what you want to hear.
Yeah.
But in marketing research, when you have companies that try to make everything opaque and proprietary, they're also going to tell you, the clients, what they want you to hear, which is that they can be trusted, their data is reliable, but you never actually get to see the ins and outs to confirm that that's the case. And
I also really appreciate this idea that, unlike for us in marketing who care an awful lot about our products, most of the time when a consumer is deciding on a purchase, they're only paying so much attention. They're either overwhelmed because the shelf is full of colorful things, or they've only had so much time to review something. And so anything we can do to make that decision easier for them in our favor is in our best interest.
Absolutely.
So, what's the hard part here? How do I test someone's implicit bias? Because it's implicit. Like, that's pretty tricky. Clearly, I can't ask them.
Certainly not in the conventional ways. We don't ask them. But how we measure implicit associations, they're very... First, how we measure implicit associations is using computers and reaction time. And the methodology is quite elegant. It's very simple, yet it's so easy to get it incorrect when you're actually designing these experiments. And I think that the simplicity of the methodology, which is asking people to sort images and words into different buckets, and the idea is that if the images and words that are more strongly associated are paired together, people should be faster and easier to put them into the same bucket than if they differ. So if I'm sorting words like Coke and Pepsi into two different buckets, the left and the right, and then I'm asked to sort good and bad words, left and right buckets again, and then I'm pairing Coke words and good words into one bucket and Pepsi words and bad words into another bucket, the stronger my association between Coke and good, then the faster I should be to respond to classifying these words when they share the same bucket that they're being put into than when they go into opposing buckets. And that general structure, which you can demonstrate on this website at Harvard, implicit.harvard.edu, is really beautiful, because to study any category or any attribute, you just need to swap out what the stimuli are.
Right.
Now, the problem with the simplicity is that people think that anyone can do this and anyone can set it up and it's super easy peasy. And then what you have is a failure to recognize that there are very classic mistakes that people make when building IATs if they don't really know what they're doing. One of these mistakes is around the language that's used. And so there's great academic research showing that my level of implicit bias towards light-skinned and dark-skinned people is influenced by just the language of the category labels I use. So if we replace Coke and Pepsi with African-American and European-American, I'll get one level of bias in response to those groups. But if I change the category labels, but keep all the exemplar stimuli the same. And it's athletes and non-athletes, I get very different levels of bias showing. And so what this and a number of other published studies show is just the wording that we use to represent our focal categories, whether it be the brands or the attributes that we want to measure associations with, can influence how well and how reliably we can measure that underlying association that we care about. And so learning how to get the language right, I think, is one of the biggest barriers that I see to using the methodology correctly. And then the second is that people erroneously think that as long as I'm capturing reaction time and I'm asking people to sort some stimuli, I've got an implicit association test. And that's not what an implicit association test is. It's much more than just the measure of reaction time and the act of categorizing. What really matters a lot is the structure of the task, how many trials you're using, and we know, and how many exemplars you use for each of the stimuli types that you're showing. And we know that the reliability of the method is completely disrupted. It's abolished, it disappears, it's no longer reliable when we make certain kinds of changes to the length of the study or to the number of stimuli that we're showing people. And I think what often we'll see in marketing research is that, and there's even been published marketing studies that have made this mistake, that they will cut down the number of trials because they want to pack in more associations to measure.
Right.
And they and then all that data, you might as well just pick randomly out of a hat to draw your conclusions, because the method is no longer a reliable method of what you're trying to measure.
Well, and the scientific method has pretty clear statistical rules for what the threshold of meaningful data. You just need to understand that well enough. But I totally get, we only have so much money to spend on testing, so let's test more things, but not as thoroughly, and ultimately end up with useless data.
Yep.
There's a certain amount of sampling that needs to be done for any given set of stimuli to know for sure.
I agree. And what I would encourage marketers to think about is when you have companies that will suggest to you, we'll find a way to measure your 30 implicit associations or your 30 concepts within some measure of an implicit association. And we can do this in a short period of time. It'll take participants 15 minutes to measure 30 different concepts. I would ask and encourage that they ask to see the raw data and what the analytic plan is,
right,
and to point to one or two papers that have been published by someone else that's not financially invested in that firm, how they do that. Because there's just no way, at least if you think about the thousands of academics who use these kinds of methodologies and are trying to innovate these methodologies, but are held to a high standard of you have to be transparent. And when you publish this work, there just aren't tools out there that allow you to measure reliably implicit associations among tons and tons of concepts in a very, with one sitting of a participant.
And is there an aspect of you can only test a given subject for so long before the quality data goes down? They just get tired?
Absolutely. There's generally, So absolutely. There's fatigue that we have to consider.
Mm-hmm.
We also have to think about just the bleeding of associations, meaning the more you're measuring an association, it's starting to prime thoughts and feelings that are going to influence the next thing that you're measuring.
Right.
And so generally, I think trying to limit the number of concepts and employ more of what I would call, and what the field calls, between subjects designs. One group of participants sees associations 1 through 6. Another group sees associations 7 through 12. And you can scale with your sample size large enough so different groups of people are responding to different associations that you want to quantify. But certainly within a sitting, I think it's ideal with consumer research to try to keep these projects down to around half an hour of their time. But then again, what one should be careful of is, even if a vendor is offering, I'll measure 30 associations in that half hour, there's just not enough trials, right? Because then the trial count becomes relevant. And where I've seen people misuse the implicit association test is, well, rather than use 120 trials or 80 trials, I'm going to measure a particular association, I'm going to cut it down to 10.
Right.
Because as long as I have some data that I've collected, it must be meaningful. But the reality is that, again, you might as well be blindfolded picking something out of a basket and making your decisions based on the outcome of that decision. Once you start deviating from the the structure of the method that's been shown to be reliable.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And I also see exactly how folks get to that place where they're just trying to do too much. I hate to throw physics on top of neuroscience, but the observer effect is a thing. And having tested someone on any given set of data, will create a bias for the next set of data. So, it could definitely see how over testing some subjects would cause problems with later sets of data. That seems very reasonable. And it just speaks to, if you're that concerned about getting this stuff right, about really understanding your market, then you also have to be willing to do the proper work to actually understand them. Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
Absolutely.
Now, the way you've described this so far seems like I'm more testing for existing bias. Like now I'm starting to think in terms of, so how do I construct a test to actually understand whether packaging A or packaging B of my new product is superior?
Great question. So in a case like that, and I think that is a classic way in which we recommend using the implicit association test in marketing research, is to first show, with one group of participants, show them one package and ask them to think about it, spend some time looking at it, evaluating it, and then measure your association with the brand of that product, and then compare that to a baseline or a benchmark where they wouldn't have seen this new package concept, and look at how there's and look to see what that difference is in the strength of association with that brand in some set of attributes of interest to you. And then another group of participants would see a different package concept, and you could compare them in this between subjects design. That's one way of approaching it. We call this a single category IAT. Then another way of doing this is to pit both package designs against each other. And sort of in that Coke Pepsi example that I referenced earlier, imagine just replacing Coke and Pepsi with design concept A and design concept B.
Right.
And now you're measuring associations there. And this gives you a slightly different answer to a slightly different question, but still allows you to contrast different package concepts. And so these are two different ways in which you can use an IAT generally to measure whether there's different reactions to a particular package design. One of the beautiful things about the IAT is that it is a very sensitive measure. So I've seen it work very effectively, not just if you're looking at, say, package designs, but whether it's a logo change, whether it's a change in font,
right.
And whether that change in fonts, for example, might influence our perceptions about the product that's being advertised. Seen it where it's in response to interaction with a product. So whether you get to touch a product or taste a product and then measure associations with it afterward. That's another context in which it's proven very effective. But implicit associations form very quickly, and they're actually difficult to change after that. They can certainly be changed, but it's difficult to change. But they form so fast that they seem sensitive to very small changes in input, in information that we give them. And so that's why I think it's so sensitive to subtle things like changing the size of a font, changing the detail of the logo, even if it's just repositioning an image that's on a logo slightly. IAT can pick up these kinds of changes. Now, of course, it's not going to change every underlying association we have with a brand or a product.
Right.
You would think it should be changing associations that it's somehow connected to conceptually. And I think one of the challenges with IAT is that it's important to recognize that its best case use is when we know what kinds of associations we want to measure. And then we want to think, how is some messaging, communication, package design, positioning statement, et cetera, changing those implicit associations,
right.
Or how are they relative to a competitor? But if you're trying to understand what thoughts come to mind when I see this new package concept, and this is now more of a discovery research question, I wouldn't necessarily start with an IAT, because an IAT works well if you know what concepts to put into it, what attributes you want to measure, and you can get that language right. So if you're just sort of pie in the sky, not sure what a person might think about a given package design, then you need to probably employ another step before you get to an IAT that helps you to narrow down what are the attributes that are meaningful, and then start to quantify those implicitly.
This seems like an approach that needs a very strong hypothesis in the first place, that you know what brand attributes you care about and respond to, and that actually stimulate good outcomes. And so you're measuring increasing those rather than that initial speculation. What do you think of this? Which always, never been a fan of those questions. The results, this don't, what mood does this generate? Like, save me. These are very hard things to determine, but I think, I appreciate the idea that you better have a pretty good idea of how people are already responding to your brand to be able to craft these tests in a meaningful way.
Completely agree. Having that hypothesis to guide the research, whether it be prior research that you've done or plan to do, I think is really beneficial to setting yourself up for success with using the IAT.
And I realized the whole conversation we had about these bias problems, when I think about things like tinkering with fonts, immediately now I think in terms of each time I change that font, I'm going to need a separate set of subjects to measure it against. Because if I measure those kinds of changes against the same subjects repeatedly, the data is going to be biased out the window.
Completely agree.
Wow. I'm delighted that I have an insight here. It's like, this is why this is hard. You need to pick these tests carefully. They're very sensitive, and you could easily fool yourself by not following the methodology very precisely.
Absolutely.
So I think we've really explored this idea of how I could measure better packaging, better logos, that kind of sort of physical assets for around a product, and how people's implicit bias respond to that. Are there other ways to use IAT that are beneficial to an organization?
Certainly, more generally, when we think about concept testing, for example, if it's video ads or print ads or even a website redesign, and getting to have the opportunity to say, watch an ad or to see an ad if it's a print ad, and then look at how perceptions of that brand are now influenced by having viewed that ad, right? And so anytime we are watching finished ads, they have a long history from being a concept statement to a storyboard to the final product, and even candidates that had to be adjudicated among before the final thing was produced. And all along that way, IAT can be very useful in measuring the effectiveness of those iterations of those concepts in delivering on the specific messaging that a company is trying to facilitate with that concept.
And I'm thinking in terms of cost savings here, that if I could actually storyboard 6 versions of an ad before I commit to the production cost to make it, even I could make all 6, because the expensive part is putting it out there, right? I only want to put one of them out, but I love the idea that I could storyboard 6 and say, okay, which one of these is quote unquote best?
Absolutely. And that's a perfect case use of IAT. I think another one that's a derivative of this as well is if you're thinking about putting together a video ad, and we know there can be different costs for production and for putting it out there, whether it's a 10-second, a 5-second, or a 30-second long ad, you can measure with an IAT what aspects of your message are still getting through that matter most to you in that 5-second or 10-second iteration. So you don't necessarily need that longer 60-second version out there. And that can be especially helpful.
Save me twice. My production costs and my buy costs go down. If you can show me that this 15-second ad works, gets across core concepts. Would we actually see one's better than the other, or does a 60 convey more information than the 15? Now we're getting into people's attention spans too.
I've seen it work all different ways. I think beyond attention span, it's really about the effectiveness of the ad in delivering on the messages that a client is trying to, a company wants to deliver on with respect to positioning of their product. And I think what you'll expect to see is that it's not that it's all greater or all worse, that depending on the associations you're measuring, maybe if it's a food product and you have things like, is it healthy? Are the ingredients fresh? Is it tasty? Is it premium quality? You're going to get different influences on those different associations as a function of the content of the ads and what is emphasized in that extra time that's in the longer ads. And so I think you can expect a lot more variation in more interesting insights from the data, because it'll tell you which parts of the message are getting across in that short time span and which parts require the longer time span. And then it becomes a business decision. Maybe you decide that extra boost that I get on perceptions of tasty isn't so bad if I forego the longer ad because I already know in my category I'm dominating in that perception of tasty relative to competitors, right? And that brings us up to another area you can use IATs quite nicely, is to measure the competitive landscape and how are other brands doing today with respect to the attributes that you think that matter in your category space and for your product in particular. And it allows you can use IAT to track that over time. Now, one thing I would caution against is too frequent measurements. I don't think you need to use an IAT, for example, monthly, unless there's a lot of activity in terms of messaging, communications, advertisement that you or competitors are investing in that time frame. But you can use it for tracking purposes to see how your brand is doing relative to competitors within the category, along the dimensions that you think matter most for success in that category. So what those attributes are that you think matter most.
But there is this supposition that you already understand the aspects that matter most to a consumer's buying decision or reaction to your product one way or the other. And that's, again, I feel like you could go a long way off the track if you haven't done your homework in the first place to really know this is what influences a buying decision either way.
Absolutely. And so I think that, again, that discovery work up front is really important. I think that it's possible that you can combine IAT with other methods to try to look at and then do some fancy statistical modeling to try to figure out what aspects of our implicit biases are most related to those purchase decisions within that category space. But again, you want to be pooling methods and using a multi-method approach to accomplish that endeavor. Yeah,
this is a multidimensional thing. The challenge of you've also got to know enough about where your competitors are and really sort of do all that front end work to be able to measure a meaningful thing. Are you actually talking about showing the competitors' packaging side by side? Like, well, I don't wonder what those measurements look like when you start doing landscape analysis like that.
So what I would recommend, and I think what's best practices here, is you would have different samples measuring associations with your brand and then with your competitor's brand, and treat them separately. And so I would get an independent read from a group of participants on how my competitor or my customers think about this competitor, that competitor. And so you'd get those independent reads and then put that into a nice, beautiful map to sort of show where are you doing well, where are you at parity with competitors, where are you underperforming relative to competitors.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I almost wonder, especially when we talk about the duration of marketing materials, that sort of thing. It's like, are there certain ideas that simply require more time to influence versus ideas that do convey in a short amount of time, whether it's important to you to go to those longer time values? Or I don't know if there's any consistency across that. That sounds like a very meta test to say, when we talk about trust across all these different things.
Right. I think there's a number of factors that would influence this. And so it's definitely not a one size fits all answer. It'll matter what types of brands we're talking about. Some brands are going to be much more personally relevant to our sense of self. We see this a lot, for example, with Apple products and the idea of there being an ecosystem that we're a part of. And many people strongly identify as being an Apple person or an Android person. And that has implications for, many kinds of products. And that's going to influence our resistance to changing our beliefs about the category. Other types of products people might not be as invested in. It may not be as strongly associated with their own self-concept. And I think that in those cases, it can be, or they could be a newer product or a newer brand, a newer category. And those might be things that it could be easier to move around in terms of the associations where you might expect that frequent measurements might produce changes in what we're expecting to see. So I think that, again, there's not a one size fits all answer here, but it takes an understanding of your category and the competitors within that category, and to be able to advise on what's the best approach for assessing what that landscape looks like and how often you might want to check up on it.
It occurs to me that culture's got to play a huge role in this too. And I was thinking just going into different countries might be one thing, but when I think about big places like the United States or the EU, there's enough cultures within that space alone that I imagine you have to craft different tests and different expectations to touch any given market.
Well, I think you craft a single test, but what you build into it are a lot of segment analyses where you expand your sample to make sure you're drawing on representative populations so you can do those cultural tests appropriately. Now, I say it's a single test in that there's amazing data from millions and millions of people around the world in academic studies showing that you can take this IAT in just about any language and you don't need computer experience to successfully take it. It's such a simple exercise where people have gone hand in foot with computers into communities where there's no internet access or people don't own their own computer or smartphone or tablet and haven't interacted with such technology. And with a brief introduction can get right into the method and you can reliably measure their implicit associations. And so I think, again, the method is very globally friendly.
Right.
And it's mobile friendly too, which is beautiful.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case 15 years ago when this work was starting, but it is the case now. But the sensitivity to cultures, it'll matter for the language. So let's say I'm a global brand and I want to measure associations with my product in the US and in Russia and in Vietnam. And I care about, say, associations with my product in this idea of being healthy or trustworthy. Is my brand seen as trustworthy? What means trustworthy in these languages is going to be different. So again, the language becomes so important and in getting that concept right. Now, another way in which culture could be relevant here is that the attributes that matter most to those consumers might differ for what motivates them. And again, that's where that doing your homework first is kind of important in order to guide what attributes to put into the IAT in Vietnam versus Russia versus US.
Sure. Now, I was thinking the word tasty as maybe not portable across cultures. And then certainly even when you get it somewhat portable, may not be significant in some cultures as well.
Absolutely. Right. So all that work you'd want to do to appropriately craft the stimuli that go into the IAT. Again, this bears on, at the end of the day, if you put junk into it, to the method, you're going to get junk out of it. And if you put something good into it, you're going to get something good out of it. Yeah,
and that pre-work clearly is important. But I do appreciate that the test itself is going to be fairly reliable, given you do that cultural adjustments. We've only really focused on implementing IAT with the time computer side of things, although you talked about, like, that's not even essential. What are the other approaches to doing testing with IAT?
Oh, well, to clarify, what I mean is that if people don't have their own technology, that you can go to communities where people don't and bring that technology there, and that even if they've never interacted with computers, can still take an IAT. And so it's a very simple method to experience and to interact with. So
inexperience with computer is not, being experienced with computer is not a barrier to doing a computer-based IAT test with them.
Correct. Yeah. And further to this point, the academic research, including some of my own research, has shown that you can administer IATs to children down to 4, 5, 6 years of age very reliably. And so that's, again, a population. Now, of course, children today have more experience with computers, but even so, it's not the kind of experience that really bears a lot on this exercise.
And I'm sure that depends on where you are, too. There are plenty of places in the world where 5-year-olds don't have access to computers.
Yep. But we can measure their implicit associations. And that work has been done around the world with this age group. And so using the method, and that's really nice because certainly now, while companies may not necessarily be measuring what a 5-year-old and 6-year-old necessarily think about a product, certainly in later childhood and absolutely throughout adolescence, people are. And knowing that this is a method that can be continuous across ages is really reliable, is a benefit because it allows you to look at developmental changes and how different populations and age groups think about your product or brand, for example.
Sure. And yeah, the dependency on language gets interesting when you get into younger kids too. And I still am interested in that idea of, do people do IAT without computers? Like I wonder how that works.
Right. So there's been a little bit of research around a paper pencil version of an IAT, and this took place over a decade ago. And there's some evidence of it working for sure. I would not say though it's robust enough that and has been tested enough across independent labs to say I would put my stamp of approval on it at this stage. But there's certainly been some efforts to explore doing paper pencil versions of it. But it hasn't been sufficiently independently validated, in part because I don't think, at least in academia, there hasn't been that motivation to try to solve that problem. And given the ubiquity of computers, at least within academic institutions where a lot of the original work was done.
Right. Well, and it's timing tests, and computers are very, very good at timing. Like that's certainly the strength on the machine side of things for that. I definitely appreciate the thinking. Have we talked about the different species of IAT? Is there other areas we should be looking?
Sure. So there's two major kinds of IAT. Mm-hmm. The traditional IAT that pits, say, two brands against each other, like Coke and Pepsi, and asks you which do you implicitly have a preference for,
right,
in a classic IAT. And what that gives you is a relative assessment of which brand you like relatively more. It doesn't tell you whether you think one is really good and one is really bad, right, or if you think both are good and one's a little bit better, or both are bad and one's just a little less worse.
Right.
What's called a single category IAT allows you to tease that apart more. So you would first just measure associations only with Coke, and you'd measure it separately just for Pepsi. And that would give you a read on how much do you generally like Coke, how much you generally like Pepsi. So you can see, are they both positive or both negative? But what it doesn't tell you is that when they are pit head to head, whether those differences are enough to lead one to clearly win out over the other.
Right.
And so again, there's some trade-offs. Now, what I see is more common in marketing research is doing the single category IAT, because often there's either a lot of competitors, mm-hmm, and it's not just this one obvious one to stick to compare your brand against, or it's more about trying to understand, well, let's just understand where my brand is today. So I'll do a benchmark test on how my brand is doing today, and then I'll measure the impact of some new concept that I'm trying to test. And so I care just about, am I doing better than what I was doing, or am I hurting myself by making this change? Now, where I stand relative to competitors tends to be a separate question,
right,
that is not often built into the research agenda when trying to do message testing, concept testing more generally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I can see why both those are used for different scenarios. Andy, thank you so much for this. I've got a better grip now on what implicit associated testing is all about. Are there other resources you like to point people to? We've talked about a couple of books, and I would love to any other things that folks should be reading if they really want to get more involved.
Sure. Well, I think certainly just generally understanding the methodology and going to the implicit.harvard.edu mm-hmm. website is a great resource. There's also a paper that I published in 2017 in the Journal of Marketing Management titled Barriers to Advancing the Science and Practice of Marketing. Mm-hmm. And I think this would also be a really good paper to read because it's a good introduction and demonstration of how classic methods within the cognitive sciences can be misused in marketing research, and what are some of the things to look out for? What are some of the recommendations that we make for practitioners to look out for when considering how to adjudicate between options that different vendors are providing?
Excellent. And certainly we'll provide links to that. Good for folks getting more educated. Dr. Andy Barron, thanks so much for talking to me.
Thank you, Richard.
And we'll talk to you again on Understanding Consumer Neuroscience.